Hello and welcome to another episode of the Small Agency Talk Show. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, the founder of SAGA, the Small Agency Growth Alliance, and I am delighted to have with me one of my regular panelists, a good friend, Marcel Petitpas of Parakeeto. Welcome to the show, Marcel.
Thank you for having me, Chip. Always a pleasure to hang out with you.
It is great to have you, and we've already been having a bit of a pre-show conversation, and we're getting fired up already, so this should be a great show. But for listeners who may be tuning in and haven't seen you on the show before, tell us a little bit about yourself and where they can find you.
Yeah, so I'm Marcel, and I call myself the agency profitability expert. My whole thing is helping agencies measure and improve their performance. So I'm a nerd when it comes to all things metrics, data, KPIs, and reporting inside of an agency to measure things like project profitability and resource planning and all those things that you're probably struggling with right now. If you want to learn more about us, parakeeto.com. We've got a ton of free resources and content there for you to listen to as well.
And you are a data nerd, data geek, which is why I love talking to you, because I am too. I love digging into numbers. And we're going to be talking about some numbers today. Particularly, we're going to be talking about pricing, because that's what got us fired up most in the pre-show. And so I think it should be interesting for listeners. If you're watching us live and you have comments or questions, feel free to use the chat function on whatever platform you're watching on. If you are watching this on replay, well, we can't involve your comments in our live show because we don't have time travel yet, but we'll be happy to respond to it on, again, whatever platform you're watching this on. So with that, let's dive right in, because we do try to keep these shows to 30 minutes or less. Pricing. Do agencies get pricing right most of the time or wrong most of the time?
It's a good question, Chip. It's definitely like one of the most commonly asked questions, I'm sure, for you. I see it come up all the time as well. It's a source of confusion. It's a source of insecurity. Are we charging the right amount? Are we structuring our contents, our contracts right? And I would say that most of the people that I talk to, there's a significant opportunity for improvement in the way that they price their services. And I want to.
I'm sorry. Are you working at the State Department? Because that was awfully diplomatic, Marcel.
Very diplomatic.
Maybe it's because I'm so fired up today, but I'll just say they get it wrong more often than not.
I mean, I do see the odd agency that I think is thinking about it in the right way, but it's the exception, not the rule, for sure.
Yes. And so, how should agencies be thinking about pricing?
Yeah, so that's a big question, right? I think far too many people right now are getting wrapped up in the thing that I hate most about this industry, which is all of the dudes in t-shirts with a whiteboard yelling at them in their Facebook and Instagram feed about how they need to productize their services or go to value-based pricing or, like the next silver bullet agency tactic, without stepping back and starting with what problem do we solve? How do we solve it for clients? What is the reality of how that solution needs to be delivered in order to actually bring value to our clients? And then once we've established that, then looking at pricing as an exercise of how do we appropriately structure our pricing and our contracts to share risk with the client, as well as capture as much value as we can in the value that's being created through our service.
So a couple of things you said there that I want to drill in on. The first is I want to offer my wholehearted support for the statement about the YouTube videos from the so-called experts with the white boards and the muscle shirts and things like that, which is all fascinating stuff. I mean, it's but there is no shortcut. There is no simple answer to how you can, skyrocket the profitability of your agency in just 4 hours a week. These things just don't exist. You have to actually roll up your sleeves, do some hard work, and figure out what's working for you and your clients and go from there. But the second thing that you said, after we bash that portion of our own industry, is the idea of risk. And we were talking a little bit about this pre-show. Risk is such an important thing to consider in pricing, but I think it is often overlooked. And it's one of the reasons why when I work with clients on pricing, I have what I call the floor to ceiling model. I know you've got your own model that you work with. In my case, floor to ceiling, basically, you need to know what the minimum is you need to charge to stay out of trouble. How much do you need to charge in order to make, the bare minimum acceptable profit for you? That's your floor. And then from there, you kind of go on up. And where you go on up is the risk that the client has and the risk that you have. And so you're really measuring part of that risk. But why don't you talk about risk? Because I know it's important to your model as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So in short, the way I define risk very simply is how accurately can you predict the amount of time or money that's going to need to be invested to get the promised outcomes to the client. And so I'll give you kind of two dramatic examples. The first is you are running an agency that builds WordPress websites using Elementor for lawyers, and you've done 1,000 of them, and you can predict within 5%. You have a clear process. It's all documented, automated, all that stuff. Like you know exactly how much time it's going to take you to do that website when you sell it, versus you build custom enterprise software solutions on a new technology that's poorly documented and doesn't have a ton of support, and you're also trying to solve a novel problem that hasn't really been done before in the industry. There's no way to predict how much time that's going
Right.
to take, right? Like you're doing story points, you're doing agile, and you have to try and create an engagement with that client that is going to account for the fact that you're not going to know the scope of a feature until you're halfway into it, and the fact that the scope of the project is inevitably going to change a dozen times over the life cycle of it, because like you can't even today define what the deliverable is. So those are two extreme examples, but just to draw the contrast, one you can predict, the other it would be foolish to assume that you can.
Yeah, and so that's great. You really need to measure that risk that you have as an agency, so you're covering your bases and you're making sure that you're not causing more problems for yourself, because it's often great on that day when you sign the contract with the client, you're really excited, but then when you go back and crunch the numbers later, and I do hope you're crunching the numbers later to see how profitable that individual project was, that's when you might get disappointed if you didn't price risk in appropriately. But risk is also something that you need to consider from the client standpoint, right? Because from a client standpoint, the more risk that they take, that's effectively them needing some kind of a discount to justify the work. Whereas if it's a sure thing, they're much more likely to pay a premium. So if I come to you, Marcel, and I say, okay, Marcel, if you give me $500,000, I'm going to write you a check for $1 million. You would do that in an instant, I would imagine, right? Yeah. Assuming that you trusted me.
Paperwork, but
right, yeah, but you'd literally be an idiot not to do that, because you've been promised doubling of your money just for going through the transaction. But if I said to you, you write me a check for $500,000, I might be able to get you $1 million in a year. Now you're going to think a lot more carefully about it, and you're probably going to come back and say, well, maybe I'll give you $100,000 on that, possibility, right? Because you're pricing risk into that equation, and so your clients are doing this too. And so if in that example that you gave, you've built 1,000 websites for lawyers, you know what you're doing. If you go to a law firm, you can charge a premium to them because they know what they're going to get. You can show your track record. If you're just getting started in a new area where you haven't been before, client's going to be like, well, I don't know. Kind of take a flyer. Might work out, might not.
Well, and this is the second aspect that I consider when I'm trying to help an agency figure out what the right pricing model is for not even their whole agency, but each individual service within the agency, because sometimes you need to treat things differently, and it's value, right? So how do I think about value? I think there's kind of two primary measures of value, or two primary influences. The first is how commoditized is the thing that you do. And a big part of that just comes back to positioning. Like you might what's the difference between, and this, Chip, I'm a graphic designer versus we are a graphic design firm that specializes in helping B2B SaaS companies communicate complex data systems to their clients through design. Like same fundamental thing, graphic design, but of course, like how many other firms like that are you going to find on the planet? And if you're a B2B SaaS company or a B2B consulting company like us, that is currently right now, we are struggling to communicate what we do visually, then like, if you told me that that's the problem that you're an expert in solving and had a portfolio to show it, I would pay you a lot more money than any other graphic designer to specifically help us solve that problem. So that's the first one, is scarcity. And then the second one is, of course, relative value. And this one, I think, gets overblown, right? We talked about it before the show, the FedEx logo versus the pizza shop logo. But there is truth in that there are different, there is a relativity to value where, and I think a simple example of this would be like conversion rate optimization on a website. If a website does $100 a month in sales and you increase their conversion rate by 10%, well, that's only worth $10 a month to them. But if they're doing millions of dollars in sales, it's worth a lot more. the assumption that we make naively there, of course, is that the scope is exactly the same. We know that that's not true. However, there probably is some separation that we can start to create between the increase in scope versus the increase in relative value to the client. So those are kind of two things I consider thinking about value. And I have a quadrant. So like horizontally, you think about risk. You have high risk on the right-hand side, you have low risk on the left-hand side, and then vertically you have value. You have high value at the top, low value at the bottom. So imagine you have the quadrant. The way I think about this is starting in the bottom left. If you have high risk, low value, you're probably going to be a time and materials shop. That's probably the right way to do it, because as long as you can figure out how to be efficient, find the right processes so you can drive your cost per hour down, you can compete on price, because that's what you're doing. If you're in a low value commoditized service, do whatever you can to try and make yourself less commoditized, but you got to ask the client to share the risk with you, of course, because otherwise it's a recipe for disaster. On the bottom right hand corner, you've got low risk, low value. That's where I think flat pricing works really, really well, because you can take a lot of risk off the table for the client by giving them a flat price, but arbitrage the fact that you know exactly how long it's going to take to ideally increase your average billable rate. Because of course, Chip, if I said to you, hey, it's going to cost you $500 for me to build you that legal website, you'd be like, go pound sand, man. $500 is crazy. But if I tell you it's $1,000 and I can get it to you in 2 weeks and it's blazing fast, SEO optimized and guaranteed to convert, and you're like, that's a great deal. I might still make $500 an hour, but it doesn't matter to you because I've taken the risk off the table. Top left, that's high risk, high value. This is where I really like abstracted time and materials. I see a lot of the big successful shops that do high risk work. So you're thinking like the Media Monks, and there's one here called Think Different, where they're doing like custom enterprise websites, custom application development. They'll take the time and materials model, the hourly model, and they'll just abstract it a little bit. So you're not buying hours, you're buying a cross-functional team that has a couple designers on it, some strategy, some whatever. It's 20 grand a week. And we think this project is probably, 12 to 16 weeks to get the deliverables that you've defined. And inevitably those end up being 3-year engagements that are just ongoing, where you're basically leasing them a team, but you use the fact that it's high value to abstract away from the hour and hopefully create a higher average billable rate in the process. And then finally, you have high value, low risk. This is where we start to talk about value-based pricing. But I think value-based pricing is misunderstood. So maybe we should stop here and start unpacking value-based pricing, a very hot, very contested idea in the industry today.
So before we get into value-based pricing, I want to address the heresy that you've just introduced here, because I'm sure that our whiteboard, muscle-shirted friends are going to be recoiling at this idea. Not that they're actually listening to us, but if they were, they would be twitching at this notion of actually using time and materials or billable hours in any way, shape, or form, abstracted or not, in order to come up with pricing. And I'm sure their heads are exploding at this concept. And there are some folks out there, I'm sure, who are listening to us who have heard these proclamations that you should never charge by the hour because it undersells your value, blah, blah, blah. It sounds to me like you are saying that you agree with me on this, that, there's a time and place for that.
Yes, I 100% do. And the argument that all of them make that I think it just kind of grinds my gears is just that like every agency can change their business model to decrease risk, right? So like productize your services, clearly define your scopes of work up front, stop doing so much custom work, et cetera, et cetera. Like those are all just ways of architecting your business model to take risk off the table. But if that's not how that problem is going to get solved, like if SpaceX needs you to start writing software for the motor control systems that land a rocket ship upright on a barge in the middle of the ocean, and they're willing to hire somebody needs to do that work. Some agency is going to get that contract, and you can't productize that. So that's, I think the thing that really bothers me about it is like, not everybody can just change their business model to lower risk so that they can take on these other pricing models. And we need agencies that do high risk work, and those agencies should be using a pricing model that allows them to share that risk with the client. So yes, right. I think it's appropriate. And I think that it's also false to say that any kind of customer high risk work is bad. Adapt the business model to make it viable and There's huge agencies that are very successful that do high risk work because they understand this, that the business model can be adapted to accommodate for risk.
Well, and the arguments against the billable hour are just, straight up dumb. Because they say things like, well, you'll never get rich charging by the hour. Have you hired an attorney lately? I mean, if your company has a lawyer, you're going to figure out that the billable hour actually works out quite nicely for some people. Here's the thing. You can't assume that you're going to be charging the same rate as, the local, just getting started web developer. Right? If you are not charging the fair amount of time for your billable hour, then sure, you're going to get held back. You just need to charge more for your hour. And so this whole argument that I also hear, well, they're not paying for all that I've learned over the last 20 years because you're not factoring it into your rate. Put it into your rate. Just the lawyer that I've used for all my businesses for the past 20 plus years charges me a hell of a lot more today than he did in 1999 when I started working with him.
Well, and there's another idea here, like, yes, charging more is one strategy, but I would also make the argument that you don't have to have a high hourly rate to make a lot of money. It doesn't, man, we're getting fired up on this. We do audits. We do a lot of audits. And one of the objections that we get on sales calls for the audits all the time, especially when we're talking to people that are in other geos, like if they're in the UK or they're in Australia or they're in India or South America, is they're like, well, how are you going to benchmark us? Like, do you have enough data for our country to tell us, like, to benchmark us on our hourly rate? And then what I tell them at this juncture is, well, hourly rate is one of these several metrics that we'll benchmark you on. I'll be honest with you. The only reason we put it in here is for vanity, because it doesn't matter. What matters is the delta between your cost per hour and your hourly rate. If that margin is healthy, then your business model works. So maybe you're in an industry where the highest you can charge is $25 an hour. But if your labor costs you $4 because you can arbitrage a foreign economy and you have great process and you've figured out how to make that work, then you can make a ton of money with enough volume. It doesn't matter what your average rate is. It matters what the margin is on that rate. It matters what the margin is on your delivery. That's what allows you to build a successful business that can scale and make you rich.
Yeah, and you've touched on a broader concept here, and I don't want to stray too far afield of pricing since that's sort of where we started. But hey, it's our show. We get to do what we want with it. I love that you took a shot at benchmarks here, because benchmarks in isolation are just stupid. Benchmarks have a role. You can use them as a data point to inform some of the things that you're looking at, but they should never be the be-all, end-all. And I get asked all the time, what percentage of my expenses should be labor? What percentage of it should be overhead? What percentage should be office space? What profit margin should I be getting? And those are all, they're nice questions in the abstract, but you really need to just look at your own business and say, are you happy with the way it's performing? Are you happy with the work that you're doing, the amount of time that you're working, and the amount of money that you're making as the owner? If those three if you can't say yes to all of those things, it doesn't matter how close you are to them. You can be spot on with the benchmarks, but if you're not happy with those three things, you're going to be unhappy with your business. So start with those, use the benchmarks to inform it, but don't live and die by them.
Yeah. And I think one of the problems as well with benchmarking is that there's no common language around it. So I even saw this in an industry report. I'm not going to call them out by name, but really big agency association with a really big expert accounting firm that should know what they're doing, surveying thousands of agencies, asking them about utilization. Nobody defined the calculation for utilization. So we get the results back and they're all over the place. And somebody within one of my clients' firms raises a flag and is like, our utilization is super low relative to this benchmark we just saw. And I'm like, well, there's no calculation. So let me show you 6 different ways that we can calculate utilization. And then you can tell like what the spread is. Like our utilization is 85% if we only look at billable capacity. Our utilization is 72% if we take out all of the admin and sales staff. Our utilization is 60% if we look at it globally across the whole agency. Like there's no common language for benchmarking. So unless you have a system, so like this is something that we've done, we have a system by which we normalize every agency regardless of what their business model is. So whether you outsource 100% of your work to a white label partner or you do everything internally, we have to structure every agency so they're all the same structurally, and we're isolating expenses in the same format before we can benchmark them, because otherwise the benchmark is basically completely meaningless, because there's so much variability in how agencies pass revenue through onto other people, structure their delivery teams. Like, we have to take these things into account. We have to normalize the calculations as well.
Right. And utilization rates is really one of the ones that I hate the most, because it's almost impossible to, even when you control for a lot of those things, it's still almost impossible, because you have to compare specific roles, and titles have become so meaningless. I would argue that even when I was getting started in my career 30 years ago, they weren't all that meaningful, but they had more meaning than they do today, where an account executive in one firm may be nothing like an account executive in another one. Vice presidents, get minted by the dozens these days. So, what the heck does that title even mean? So when you're trying to compare, you're not comparing apples and oranges. It's so easy to categorize time differently, as you've said. There are just so many factors that go into it that, to me, utilization rate is really one of those bonkers things that people get wound up about. But really, you need to look at individual project profitability and gross agency profitability. And if you look at those two numbers, those are the things that will help you make the right decisions about how you're using your team. Not that they say, I can be 95% utilized and still be a useless employee. Right? It's quite easy. And in fact, I would argue that there comes a point of diminishing returns with utilization rates. A lot of people try to push utilization rates higher, but the higher they are, that means that they're not, contributing to the overall growth of the agency, which really every employee in every agency has the ability to do.
Yeah, I believe that utilization is a useful metric, but I've not once spoken to a client that was calculating it properly, that had a target that was set properly. So actually looking at, like, first modeling the whole team, the expectations we have, how much vacation time they get, like the reality of, like, what is a realistic expectation, and then basing the target on that, or using it to inform decisions or conversations or expose it to the right people properly. So it's a dangerous metric, because it's always used wrong, and it's counterproductive, I would agree, when it's not used properly. And the way to use it right is not straightforward. It's very specific, it's very nuanced, and it is very individualized to the agency and their team composition and their culture and their expectations, and a lot of times geography. Like, we just did an audit for a client in the UK. They get a crazy amount of time off in the UK. We should learn from Europe. They take a lot of holidays. First of all, they call everything holiday. And
right.
They get a lot of time off. The average person had 40 days off a year paid. Right. It's crazy. So
yeah, no, it is. Because I've worked in an international agency before, and so you work with members of the firm in other countries, and you're like, are you ever in the office? It seems like you're always on holiday. I'm confused. What's going on here? But the other problem with utilization rates, or a lot of these other benchmarks, is they become weaponized. And so you want to be tracking the data and learning from it, but don't use it as a weapon. Don't go to someone and say, I expect you to have a utilization rate of 85% or 90%. Because guess what? Their reporting is now going to skew towards that. And they will turn in timesheets and other reports that indicate they're hitting your target, because they want you to be happy and they don't want to deal with problems. So you're now getting bad data. So you've got a bad target with bad data, and it just gets worse from there.
The only place that playbook is less destructive, I'm going to say, I don't want to say that it works, but it's less destructive, is if you're actually a true time and materials shop that actually bills all of the time that your team works to the client unapologetically and rarely is eating hours. In that case, your team is incentivized to rack up as many hours as possible. And so, like, that is and that's the reason I think utilization has been used that way historically, because that was the playbook that agencies of old ran when time and materials was the standard. And They got away with it. I'm going to say they got away with it because the business model is able to adapt to that. But I agree. That's like the biggest mistake I see people make, is they tell somebody to hold themselves accountable to utilization. And now they've just undermined the entire purpose of, like, one of the core pieces of their operation system, which is getting accurate data that helps you understand how long it actually takes to get things done. It's brutal.
And that's a perfect segue to bring us back to where we were, because accurate data and accurate information and all that feeds into this whole value pricing idea.
Yes.
That is really the holy grail of agency pricing. And so we really can't end our time together without taking a good close look at value pricing, because a significant number of our friends in the agency consulting world will tell you value pricing is the way to go. Is it?
It is for some people. I think it has a place, but we have to understand when it's appropriate, right? So in my model, I think of it as being only appropriate once we have achieved relatively low risk in our service offering, and we have positioned ourselves and have also been able to get in front of clients that have a very high amount of value, or value us and value what we do at a very high rate. In that case, it becomes appropriate to start evaluating value-based pricing as the way to move forward. And so understand that, like, you're not stuck in high risk work forever. You can mature a product, a process, you can collect data over time, refine it, and move from high risk into low risk. So understand that you can start to graduate to this stuff, and you can also start to move your value up by becoming more niche, building a better portfolio, like all the things that, agencies are trying to do. Once you've achieved that, then I think value-based pricing is appropriate. But that leaves 3 of the quadrants where I don't think it's the right answer. And unfortunately, the messaging that we are bombarded with is that if you're not doing value-based pricing, you might as well just throw your whole agency in the trash can and light it on fire, because you're a crazy person.
Right. Well, I mean, here's the problem. If you ask 5 different agency owners and 5 different quote unquote experts what value pricing is, you will get a different answer from every single one of them. There'll be some overlap for sure, but they will not be able to all give you the same definition. And if you have 5 people look at the same project and give you the value price for it, you'll probably get 8 different prices, because a couple of them are going to say, well, it's either this or it's that, right? Yeah. So it's the problem is when you say something is the solution and it's that difficult for someone to wrap their arms around, it becomes a problem. To me, value pricing has just become shorthand for you need to charge more, right? Mm-hmm. You're creating more value, you should be charging more. Yeah. I can't tell you what that number is, and neither can those experts.
Now, I'm going to go out. I'm going to start naming names here. It's risky. I'm sorry, Chip, but it's in a good way. There is one source of information that I think everybody, if you are curious about value-based pricing, go and start consuming Blair Enns' content, because he's honest about the constraints in which this is appropriate. And he'll tell you that it's not appropriate for everyone. He's honest about that. And he's clear that, like, there are some prerequisites to value-based pricing. It's not for everyone. He's talked about this publicly. And I also think that his way of thinking and the volume of content and the depth at which he goes that is the one place that it, like, if you want to learn more about it, that's where I would go. And then to your point, Chip, I think there's a lot of people that have basically taken his work and the work of all the other people that Blair was influenced by when he wrote his content, and bastardized it and conflated it and stretched the meaning to mean other things that essentially support the agency operating system that they're selling you for a $99 course in a Facebook ad.
Right. And I would agree. I mean, I think Blair's content on this is by far the best. He's got a lot of other good stuff about, developing new business for your agency and pricing, and he's done deep dives and all that. So I certainly encourage folks to read and consume it. I would say even his portion on value pricing, though, I think it's important to look at with a skeptical eye for your own business, for the reasons that he enunciates in the work, but also because it's really tricky for someone to do this without deep expertise in the clients that they're serving. And most agencies, sadly, are more generalist than they would care to admit. Yeah. And so to really get good at value pricing, you need to be deep into the kinds of clients that you're working with and really grasp the true value they're getting, not the quick back of the envelope, but really understand why are they doing this and how is it contributing to the bottom line and how much is it contributing to the bottom line.
Yeah. And there's a thing that we talked about before the show that I want to make sure is said before we hit our 30-minute time cap here, which is that you should always understand your minimum price before you start trying to use all of the tactics that value-based pricing has to offer to try and charge more than that. But you should know what your floor is, and that floor should be informed by a, again, relatively low risk modeling of the time and money that's going to need to be invested such that you can still achieve your 60-70% plus gross profit margin on that project. That should be the floor. And then if you see opportunities or you're learning some fun tactics and they're working and you're able to start to ask the client for more money and they feel comfortable paying that, that's great. Fantastic. But it doesn't negate the need for you to understand your cost basis on a project. And I think that's the biggest thing that I see people get wrong about value-based pricing is it means we don't have to track time, we don't have to estimate, we don't have to scope stuff. We just ask for money, we do the work, and now somehow magically we're going to be profitable. No, that's not true. That needs to be informed from what is the floor, and then let's try to push the ceiling up, which now ties nicely into your floor to ceiling model, which I'm assuming is essentially that.
Right, that you basically encapsulated it, and I would say that more agencies will see more contributed to their bottom line if they just understand what their floor is for individual projects than if they try to get wrapped around the idea of value pricing. Because guess what? Sometimes value pricing, when done honestly and fairly, is less than what it needs to be in order to meet your floor. Because sometimes the work you're doing just isn't all that valuable. So that can be a problem. So understand what that floor is, get the pricing 101 correct. Then you can do the graduate level pricing, which is value pricing and some of the more sophisticated pricing models that are out there. So with that does bring us to the end of the time that we have available this week. But it's been great having this conversation with you, Marcel. I hope that listeners have gotten as much value out of it as the enjoyment that we've gotten out of talking about one of our favorite topics, which is pricing. And I know agencies love to talk and think about pricing because they're always trying to find ways to do better at it and make more money. So with that, thank you for your time, Marcel. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I look forward to seeing you all back here next week.